are an example of something that doesn't work as well in a monograph, and you might want to consider removing that entirely and integrating references throughout your book instead, and using that to shape an original and sufficiently broad but also compelling argument for your field and for others. Next slide, please, Jo. So on to structure. So I've written here that a thesis starts with a research question and moves to the answer, while a monograph starts with the answers. And that kind of hints at the fact that you will probably need to carry out a quite significant restructuring of your thesis to align it with the new purpose, the scope, and the audience for the book. As I said, this might involve removing chapters entirely, like the literature review, or adding new ones. You would probably want to delete any kind of repetition or rearrange the organisation entirely to ensure that your book is an engaging and clear and logical narrative and exploration of ideas. And then finally here on writing, I just wanted to leave you with a quote from Alison Wellesby, who is the head of editorial at Liverpool University Press. And she summarises the need for a distinct writing style for a book very well here. So Alison says, your book is expected to be cited in other publications, to be publicly reviewed, and is expected to make a valid contribution to the wider debates in your field. Your writing style is therefore different. You are expected to write with greater clarity, fewer references, less dense quotation, and less specialised language. You have to be more confident in your arguments, which is reflected in the tone of the work. And that really relates again to the point that I made earlier about having a stronger authorial presence and voice in your writing for the book. Whereas in your thesis, you kind of need to show that you're relying on others' arguments much more heavily in the field to kind of understand that and show that show to your examiners that you've understood the research area and are situating your voice within it. Okay, I think I'm passing on to Jo now.
Great, thank you, Emma. That's fantastic. It kind of naturally follows on, I think, from everything that Emma's been saying. And this is a question we might want to consider before kind of jumping into the process of putting a book proposal together. Is the book the right place to publish your research? And if it isn't, what are other places where you can publish your research? I think an important thing to consider at this stage is a couple of things. A couple of interlinked things, which is the question of time and the question of your planned career. So, for instance, if you have just finished your PhD and you find yourself in perhaps a fixed-term contract, a more precarious form of employment where you're doing a lot of teaching, you've got a heavy teaching workload, then you might not actually have the time to look over revising your thesis or even putting together a book proposal. So think about how your time might strategically be best spent when it comes to working on a book proposal, or perhaps working on an article and reworking some ideas of your thesis, perhaps into a peer-reviewed article during this time, which might take less time than actually fully reworking your thesis or even putting together a book proposal. And I think what's important here is allowing yourself time to consider how your book or your article is going to intervene or add to an existing disciplinary area. And that's a disciplinary area that won't have been standing still since you finished your PhD. It would have presumably, there'll be other books coming out, other articles coming out around your disciplinary area. So it's important to keep on top of those. And again, the question of time is really important there. I'm thinking of my own experience where between finishing my PhD in 2016 and it coming out as a book in 2021, there was a lot of articles and books that were coming out in the meantime that I needed to kind of keep aware of in order to update my book proposal and ultimately to produce a book that was really intervening and reflecting the disciplinary area, filling a gap, if you like, in the disciplinary area that it was contributing to. So in my own experience, and probably the reason I mentioned teaching is because I spent many years working as a teaching fellow after the end of my PhD, and I didn't have as much time to put together this book proposal that led to the book 5 years later. So I think one of the things I would recommend is don't rush, don't feel like you have to rush to put the book together. Ultimately, you're probably going to produce something that's much better if you take time to think and reflect about it. And something that really intervenes meaningfully in your field and produces something that's going to be useful for your future career. And I think there's also the point of being aware that increasingly these days, when we're applying for jobs, it's very important to be able to forge a narrative about your publications and think about why you've published at certain points in your career, what you've published strategically in terms of the time that you had to do that, and the kind of and kind of where that fits in terms of your overall publishing strategy. So, my second point here was around the differences between the social sciences and the humanities. I'm guessing there'll be a mix of us in here, and having read through some of the Padlet responses, I know that there are a mix of us in here working across the social sciences and the humanities, and we've got a very broad group here. I don't want to kind of attribute a rule to this, but generally speaking, the humanities do still require researchers to publish books, monographs for various reasons. Um, but there is now considerable variation in the kind of form that your book can take. And an example of that is that it's now more and more common that academics publish shorter form books that make a kind of clear and precise intervention in one thematic or methodological area. So in this case, you might just be taking one or two aspects of your doctoral thesis and writing this up into a shorter book of between, say, 20 and 50,000 words. And this is, as I'm sure Emma would attest, a fairly new development in the kind of academic publishing sphere. Having said that, there are also quite a few examples that we can point to. So here I've just put a couple of examples on the screen. You can see on the left there, from the left across, you've got Alison Phipps's book, Decolonizing Multilingualism, which is a small format, 112 pages, very short book. And it's actually a kind of manifesto style intervention on the need to rethink how we conceive multilingualism in university research. You've got some other examples here from the Bristol University Press and their Bristol Shorts research series. So the book on gender and COVID-19 in the Global South is about 160 pages long. The one on spectacle and Trump is 144 pages long. And then you've also got University of London Press, uh, recently published Shane Ewan's book, Before Grenfell, which is also open access. And that book there is 148 pages long. So I think you can see these shorter texts do tend to have a kind of more immediately identifiable social, political, policy relevance or implications for those sectors. So it might be an avenue for your research, or your research might actually be suited to a longer form monograph or publication, which is definitely something that academic publishers are still looking to accommodate.
एकदम आस्ते खाना एकदम लाइट वेट तो आप चिंता मत कीजिए आप मेरे घर में आएंगे आप उस तरह का तेल
I
का
think just to cover some of the main differences between an article and a book, some of these points are going to be obvious to some of you. I think you know, as Emma's already kind of alluded to, the book is going to be a sustained piece of research that brings together a coherent and significant argument. It's going to make a significant contribution to your field or your discipline. It's going to appeal to and therefore be readable by scholars in different disciplines, across disciplines. And then the point here about the REF, which is the Research Excellence Framework, which operates in the UK. And this is a very context specific thing for the UK. So those of you not in the UK won't necessarily have to think or worry about this. But I think if you are based in a UK institution, it's worth or applying for jobs in the UK, then it's really worth thinking a little bit about the ref and the kinds of ideas that people have about books in the ref and within that kind of ref context, because they're important when you're thinking about your publication narratives and when you're applying for jobs. So uh, this is an assumption, but I think a lot of people tend to kind of make it because of the length of a book, that a book is more likely than an article to get a high score in the ref. And that's to say that it's intervening and creating the kinds of impact on the discipline and change, uh, potentially across disciplines, that an article wouldn't necessarily be able to make because of the length of an article compared to a book. So, in that sense, a 4-star ref score would be more likely with a book. The second thing to say about a book is that they are double weighted in the ref, or they were in the last ref and previous refs. So that means that they count for more than a single article. So they're basically double, worth double than a single article. And that's why I think they are perceived to be more important for the ref, particularly when it comes to academic job panels. So I think this isn't something that you'll necessarily want to put in your proposal when you're writing to a publisher, but it's just something that you should be aware of when we're thinking about the differences between articles and books, and the kind of UK specific context when it comes to the research excellence framework. I'm just going to hand over to Emma now to cover the point about open access considerations. So over to you, Emma.
Thanks. There's just 2 points I want to make about open access that are relevant here. So increasingly, if you belong to a UK institution, or if your research was funded by another organisation, that it is very likely that your university or that funding body will have an open access policy that you'll need to follow. Previously, this would probably have just been for journal articles, but in the UK, as well as a number of other countries, open access policies now cover academic books. So you should make sure that you familiarise yourself with the details of your institutional or your funder's open access policy. And university staff, usually in the library or your research office at your university, should be able to help you with this if you're unsure. The second point, specifically for books with their origins in doctoral research, you're very likely to need to upload your thesis to an institutional repository at your institution. And that can have implications if you are planning to publish a book from that research as well. Publishers are going to be less likely to want to publish a thesis as it is if it is already open access via an institutional repository. So that just lends another kind of emphasis needed on the extent of revision that you would need to do to your thesis if you're wanting to publish a version of it as a book. It would just kind of need to be a different output based on the same research rather than kind of a revised version of that thesis, if that distinction makes sense. And we could talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A if that will be helpful. Okay, next slide, please, Joe. Okay, so thinking about where to publish your book. So I think it's really important that you do plenty of research into this before deciding which publisher to approach. So do that research and kind of draw up a list of your preferred publishers. That's probably the best place to start. Have a look at publishers' websites and catalogues to get a sense of what they publish. And you'll know from your own research as well which publishers are coming up time and time again in the books in your field that you're using. And I should say most commissioning editors are very happy to be contacted by potential authors in advance to check if your project is a topic that they currently publish on. It's usually best to do this at an early stage, and then the publisher can say, actually, we don't publish in that area, or we're not accepting books on that topic at that point, before you go to the effort of putting together a full proposal. So please don't feel hesitant about contacting an editor at a publishing company. That's what we're here for. So things to consider when you're choosing a publisher. Look at who's publishing in your area, which publishers have published the books that you use in your own work. Like I said, you're probably more likely to get accepted by a press if your work fits in with what they already publish, and you can point to that in your proposal. Many academic publishers also have a variety of different book series that they publish in different areas. So it's worth doing a bit of research on relevant series that there might be. And a publisher might be more likely to see your project as a fit for their list. So it's a really good idea, actually, if you do have a particular book series in mind, to like actively flag that in the book proposal. It's worth looking at which publishers have a presence in your field of research as well. So which ones are at the conferences that you go to? Are they visible online in mailing lists for your discipline? Do they have kind of global sales and distribution networks that you can see? These are all really useful things and will be useful for the publicity of your book once it's published. As I was saying, if open access is essential for your publication for institutional or funder reasons, or if it's something that you would personally like the option to have, you should check the publisher's open access policy in advance. Do they have open access options for books? And finally on this, it's worth making sure that the publisher is reputable and high quality. So in recent years, and particularly with the emergence of open access publishing, we've seen what are called predatory publishers start to appear on the scene. And these are publishers that charge a publication fee or an open access fee, but don't always provide the publishing services that authors should usually expect, like peer review, copy editing, proper distribution, that kind of thing. So it's always worth checking the directory of open access books or Think Check Submit sites, and I'll try and pop these links in the chat because they're really useful sites that index kind of reputable publishers. And obviously supervisors and colleagues will have a good idea of who kind of the reputable publishers are. So if, for instance, you get an unsolicited invitation from a publisher you haven't heard of, definitely check with your supervisor whether it's something that should ring alarm bells before kind of proceeding too far with them. Next slide, please, Joe. So yeah, as I said, ask your supervisor or a mentor or trusted colleagues. They are usually really kind of knowledgeable on where the best book series are for your topic of research. You can also ask your thesis examiners for recommendations. So it is kind of a part of the job of the thesis examiner to talk through publication options for your thesis. So definitely don't be hesitant about that conversation as part of your viva. It's always also useful to get in touch with a particular series editor, instead of or as well as the commissioning editor at a particular press. If there is a particular book series that you'd like to publish in, then definitely do get in touch with them, or you could ask again a colleague to get in touch with them on your behalf. It's worth flagging that some presses still have policies against taking on revised PhD theses. This is increasingly unusual. Most academic publishers do take on revised dissertations, but occasionally they might not, and it's worth knowing that in advance. The main thing is to read and follow the instructions for authors that are on a publisher's website. Publishers may have additional requirements or specific asks for proposals that are based on revised doctoral research, so do follow those. And obviously different publishers have different interests. Some just might not publish in your field, or they might not be prioritizing it at that particular moment. So don't take it too hard if they're not interested in the book at that point. You've done your research, you have your list of publishers on your list, so move on to the next publisher. And it's really common, so don't be too disheartened. Okay, I'm going to hand on to Joe now.
Hello.
Thanks, Emma. Sorry, just replying to some points in the chat as they try to kind of tackle them as they come up, but we will kind of revisit some of those that we can't answer in the Q&A at the end. I've also received the poll results through from Cremena, so what I might do is kind of revisit some of those questions in the Q&A at the end and put them to Emma, and perhaps Emma, vice versa. I can answer some of them myself, but I think a lot of them you'll be able to answer, Emma, but thank you for that. So writing the book proposal from an academic perspective, I think one of the really important things to remember, and one of the things that I came up against when I was writing my book proposal, was this notion of having two different audiences to target when you're writing the book proposal. On the one hand, you've got the academic audience, and on the other, you've got the publisher who's also got an interest in reviewing the proposal. I think the first person, and Emma will correct me on this, that's going to see your proposal and work with you on a proposal is the publisher, is the commissioning editor or their equivalent at the publisher. And so, really, I think you need to be aware that yes, they have an interest in the academic success of the book, in the fact that the book is making a contribution to an academic field of study, but they also are going to have a commercial interest in selling the book, or even if not a commercial interest, say it's an open access publisher, it's important that the book will attract significant interest for the publisher, in terms of downloads and things like that. So I think one has to be aware,
হ্যাঁ হ্যালো, শুনতে
um,
পাচ্ছেন?
in terms of
হ্যাঁ বলছি, আপনাকে
selling,
অনেকদিন ধরে চেষ্টা
quote
করছিলাম।
unquote, the book
হ্যালো,
to a publisher. And then on the other
হ্যাঁ
hand,
বলছি
your
যে আপনাকে
proposal's going to
অনেকদিন
be read by an academic reviewer in your field. And you've also got to, quote unquote, sell your ideas to the academic reviewer. And of course, it's important that, you tread that line between, selling the book to the publisher and to the academic reviewer. I think in most cases, their interests are going to cross over and you're not going to have too much of a problem with this. But I think it's worth, in some instances, being quite clear and straightforward and honest in certain circumstances. For example, if you have to list competing titles, competing books for your field, because I think the publisher is going to be very interested in that, in the sense of what are the gaps in the market. And the academic reviewer is going to then make a judgment based on, the originality of your work as it fills the gap in the field as well. So I think it's just worth not kind of overselling. I think it's in a proposal that's asking you about competing titles, it can be tempting to kind of really oversell your work in that area, but the academic reviewer might see that and then think, oh, they're selling it a bit too much. So I think there's really just a kind of line to tread and kind of be compelling in that sense, and be humble to a degree. On the other hand, don't undersell your work at the same time. So it's that kind of treading that line. I think clarity is the key, and confidence in your work and confidence in the kinds of interventions that you're making in the field. I'm just going to hand back over to Emma.
Okay, so from the publisher's perspective, it's relatively similar in some respects, but the kind of key points are on that slide there. So we're very much looking for a good fit for our list or for one of our book series, as I mentioned. Similar to what Joe was saying, evidence of clear need and a market for the book. So being really specific about your intended readership can be really, really helpful. We're looking for it to be based on sound research, and we'll obviously get peer reviewers' advice and input on that aspect. For academic books, we're looking for a scholarly yet accessible writing style. Obviously, a really tricky thing to balance, but the thesis is definitely good writing practice for that. And the last point is quite a key one. So a clear, comprehensive and detailed outline of the book so we can feel confident in taking it on. Most publishers make their publishing decisions and offer of a contract based on the proposal and sample material rather than the full book. So we really need to be kind of confident at that early stage, even without the full book in front of us, that it is something that we can take on, that it is a good fit for our list, that we will be able to reach the readership, that you as an author are aware of kind of how many illustrations, how many words, kind of what the overall shape of the book is going to look like. So we can make that contract with you and have a good idea of what you're going to deliver at the end of it. So that proposal document really is an incredibly vital part of the process. I just want to add a couple of other tips actually that aren't on the slide there. So you really should tell your publisher if you've submitted your proposal to another publisher. Different publishers will have different policies on this, and while it is really best practice to only submit your proposal to one publisher at once, it can be okay at a very early stage as long as you're upfront about it with all the publishers involved. And if one of those publishers lets you know that they want to pursue your proposal or start thinking about peer review, then that is the point that you really need to make the decision to withdraw your proposal from the other publishers and just stick for that one publisher. And then final tip, ask others to read your proposal before submitting it. It's really good to have that input from other people, particularly, your supervisor, other colleagues, but also people who might be from different fields. If you kind of put yourself in a publisher's shoes, we certainly don't have the expertise across all the areas that we publish in. So having that person slightly out of your field might be able to put themselves into the publisher's shoes a little more and be able to highlight anything that you might have written, which might be less clear to a non-specialist in your field. Okay, thanks. Over to Joe.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. That's fantastic. I'm going to kind of pause here, I think, and we wanted to ask you if you had any questions. And I am conscious there were many questions came up in the poll, and what I might do is kind of flick through a few of the questions in the poll. And then if you have any other questions, or if you'd like to come on live and ask a question, you're very welcome to. Just be conscious that your question might then form part of the recording. If you didn't want to be recorded, then please you put your question in the chat, then we'll happily try and get to it. But I suggest now, we've been going for about 40 minutes, so we could take 5 to 10 minutes for questions now, and then we could move on to the summary section of the of this session, if that's all right. But maybe I'll just go to I was going to go to the chat. Yeah, perhaps I'll start in the chat, and then I can go to the poll, and you and I, Emma, can kind of work through some of these questions. And then if anyone else would like to ask a question live, you can always just raise your digital hand. That's probably the best way to do it, given there are quite a few of us in the room. Well, what about this, Emma, for a starter? Ben is asking about how long it takes from the publication process, from submission of PhD thesis to publishing of a book.
That is a good question, and the answer is kind of how long is a piece of string, really. Sorry, it's a difficult one to answer. Two things I would say is that I would always recommend, if this is possible at all with your particular career circumstances and your own personal situation, to take some time between passing your viva and developing the book proposal, to give yourself kind of that breathing space to be able to reimagine it in that different form. At the time of your viva and completing your thesis, you will be so bound up with the thesis in that particular form that it might be difficult to see it in a new revised book format. So if you are able to take maybe 6 months before starting to think about putting a book proposal together, that would be ideal. The publication process, so imagine you've submitted your book proposal and you've kind of been accepted and all is fine. We would generally recommend taking a minimum of 12 months to complete your manuscript. Again, that will depend greatly on the extent of revisions that you feel like you might need, juggling other workload at the time, and kind of the review process with your publishers as well. Following that kind of revision stage, publishers' production processes take between 6 to 12 months, depending on the publisher as well. So really, it's difficult to say, but you're probably looking between kind of 18 months up to 3 years, I would say, is the average time between submitting your thesis and publishing the book. Sorry, it's really difficult to be more precise than that.
That's great. Thanks, Emma. And yeah, I suppose one of the things that I have encountered as an academic is just knowing that people take longer than they say they're going to take to do things. And I think that's just something to be aware of, that, publishers are quite understanding. I think I can perhaps speak for you, Emma, when it comes to people's more flexible timelines. Things do come up in life. Life happens. You get new jobs, you get new responsibilities in life. And so I think, there is flexibility built into the process. And I think we all understand that it's not a very set timeline. I just wanted to ask, I think there was someone, was it Pritesh? Did you have your hand up? I don't know if you're still there.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi.
Go
I'm
ahead.
from India, and my question, I had two questions actually. One was already answered by you while you were discussing. Um, but the second question that came into my mind is that I have been trying to pitch my book to several top-notch academic publishers, but my work, it seems, is less than average, and people are not really interested, even if they are from my own area. So, do you think it really matters that which publisher is going to publish my book? What if they are not like top notch, not Routledge, not Palgrave or uh, um, uh, Penguin or something like that? How does it matter, and what is the impact if I settle for a less known publisher? International, yes, but a less known publisher.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to say a word on that, and then perhaps Emma, I don't know if you had a thought on that as well. I think I think if it does matter, and I think it can matter from an academic point of view, I think it's sometimes it's unfortunate because I think people have very kind of strong ideas about what it means to publish with particular publishers. If you look at something like the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, that does not stipulate that any author would have to publish with any particular publisher. To be eligible to enter a piece of work into the Research Excellence Framework, it can be published with any publisher. And it doesn't matter what their prestige is or whatever. But I think the point is that prestige can be taken in a way as a kind of an idea of how good something is. And I think it's a bit of a shortcut for some academics, perhaps on appointment panels when they're thinking of who to appoint for a job. So I think it is important to think about who you publish with, their reputation. But at the same time, I think other ways you can think about this is maybe if you can't get interest from a mainstream publisher, there may be series that are run by, say, well-known academics in the field that you can approach, and they may be for kind of lesser known international publishers, as you mentioned, but they may be run by prominent academics in the field that you know may still may still be a good place to publish. But Emma, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. It's something we think about quite a lot, actually. At University of London Press, obviously, we're quite a small press. We're not as well known as like Oxford or Cambridge University Press, and I think it's an interesting time at the moment because there is this increasing awareness that using a publisher's name as a proxy for quality of research isn't going to fly anymore. And the DORA research assessment initiative actually is something that is becoming more widespread. There are many more signatories to this now, and hopefully that kind of decoupling of a publisher's name and prestige is increasingly happening. Um, as Joe said, I do think some of those perspectives still linger on research assessment panels, and hopefully we'll be seeing that start to diminish in future years. I think what I would say as well is that if you are thinking of going for a smaller, perhaps less well-known press, actually the different kind of service you can expect to get from that publisher might be different and in some cases better. If you go for a very, very, very large publisher, they get a lot of submissions, they're handling a lot of books all the time, and you probably get an extremely good publishing service, but it might not be as individual and tailored to your particular book as perhaps a smaller publisher who only publishes a select number of books per year. You might find a different publishing experience. And I can speak for us and a number of the other small open access presses that we work with. We're really trying to get word out there about what the quality of publishing experience you're likely to get with presses like us is. So I'm feeling cautiously more optimistic, Pritesh, on that point for the future.
Thank you both of you for your showing the path ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Pritesh. Thanks, Emma. There was another question from, is it Pragya?
Yes, hi, Joseph. Thank you so much for taking my question. So, I have two parts to my question. One is so I'm researching online harassment of women journalists in India, which is a, an incredibly sensitive topic. Now, the point is, my both my supervisors are divided on one issue, which is pertaining to GDPR. Now, in my thesis, I'm still not sure whether I can disclose the name of my participants because some of them have agreed to, but then it will be a violation of GDPR rights if I do so. But if I were to submit a book, is it okay to disclose the name of the participants when they have agreed? But then won't that be a violation of GDPR? So that's the perplexity that I am facing right now. And second is, of course, as you've already mentioned, but just to reconfirm, when I'm converting a thesis to a book, which I mean, my supervisor is incredibly keen on, um, is a complete overhaul required, or because we are focusing on a say esoteric group, or is it okay to take a part of your thesis and develop that particular aspect into a book? If yeah, so that's my question.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah,
Sorry,
am I audible? Yeah.
can you hear me? Yep. That's brilliant, Pragya. Yeah, thank you very much. It's a really interesting question. I didn't I might
Like the
revisit
second one?
yeah, I might revisit the second one in a second, but the first one, which was on
Right.
GDPR and
Yeah.
ethics, I think is very
Yeah.
specific to your case.
Yes.
And I'm not sure I
Yes.
want to respond to that kind of in any full way here. But what I would say is obviously um, that GDPR would presumably, yeah, I mean, it'd be a question of people had given consent, then presumably
Mhm.
they would form part of your thesis anyway, and they
Right.
might be named in the thesis anyway. So I don't know whether that would then bear on whether you would name them in a proposal for a publisher.
Right.
Yeah, probably need to know a bit more about the context, and that's something that an ethics committee would probably be able to advise on rather than something we could answer here. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that first part, Emma.
Okay.
Yeah, basically to echo what Joe said, I think your participants would need to have given consent specifically for publication as well as the thesis. So they would need informed consent as to what kind of publications you would take from their research. Because consent is one of the legal bases for processing data under the GDPR. There are some others which I don't know off the top of my head at the moment. But as Joe said, definitely get kind of advice from an ethics committee or as issues specifically, because it will definitely be very specific to your own work that you'll need advice on.
Right. Thank you, Emma.
And then, sorry, Pragya, there was a second part of your question.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Thanks. The second part was, um, um, I mean, a part of it has already been discussed, but I still like to iterate. Is a complete overall of thesis required when you're planning a book proposal? Because won't that be a self-plagiarism otherwise? What are your thoughts on that?
Sorry, maybe Emma, you'd have a thought on that.
Yeah, should I take that one?
Yeah,
So, well, for all the reasons that we've been talking about, the reasons relating to purpose, audience, structure, and writing, generally quite significant revision is required to make it a more successful book, to appeal to the broader audience, and kind of that broader scope and confidence that book will have in comparison to the thesis. But slightly more specific advice, most publishers do have kind of guidance on how much you can directly take from another publication and a thesis. So they might say, one chapter can be pretty much word for word as long as you acknowledge the source that it's come from.
Okay.
Perhaps two chapters, but really, I think significant revision would be needed, again, to make it a more successful book, as well as kind of avoiding that self-plagiarism issue that you mentioned.
Right. Perfect. Thank you very much, Emma and Joseph. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Fantastic. Should we take one more question from Jacqueline, and then we'll move on, if that's all right?
Hi, thanks very much indeed. I'd like to revise my thesis for a much wider audience, and I feel it would benefit from illustrations, largely from popular culture. Are there huge copyright pitfalls in that? Is that it hugely expensive to get access to illustrations?
It depends is the answer to that. And I know that's a deeply unsatisfying answer, but it can depend who is holding the illustrations, how old they are, whether they're still in the public domain, how many you want to include, that kind of thing. I would always recommend starting researching into that as soon as possible. I would also always recommend not paying for any copyright fees until you have a publishing contract under your belt. And also, the copyright holders will want information on the publisher that you're contracted with as well, in order to calculate fees and things. You can get grants. I think there's a couple of grants that I'm aware of for covering image costs in publications, but they are few and far between. So yeah, I think just starting this research as soon as possible would be my main recommendation. Again, I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but happy to help if you wanted to contact me separately with your specific case.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed.
Brilliant. Well, thanks everyone for your questions. I think they're really, really useful, and I hope we've been able to answer some of them. What we plan for the rest of the session is a more hands-on. I'm conscious there's 135 of you in here, so we're going to do this best we can, and we're going to try and use breakout rooms of probably about 5 people each. So what we wanted you to do, and this was kind of following up what we'd asked you to do in the Padlet before coming today, is to have a look at either the summaries you wrote, the 250-word summaries that you wrote, or think about kind of what you might want to say in those 250-word summaries if you haven't written them already. And take about 5 minutes in breakout rooms to discuss what you think should be in those summaries. You can take a look at the Padlet. I'll try and post the link in the chat in a second again to the Padlet, so you can kind of click on it and have a look at it. And you can have a look at other people's contributions. But essentially, what we're asking you to do, and this is actually, one might see this as a bit prescriptive, but it's actually something that I found quite helpful in putting together summaries for my articles and my work over the years. And it's a kind of suggested 5-part framework that might help you come up with a summary for your own book, and perhaps even reflect on some of the summaries that you've already put together and that you posted in the Padlet. And it's kind of structured as follows. So you start with a sentence, and yeah, generally this is not necessarily 5 sentences. It could be more than 5 sentences, but generally you could think about it as kind of sentences or a couple of sentences for each point. You've got your statement of your overall topic, material or your data, so what you're going to look at. I'm conscious this could vary across different disciplines. Number 3 would be your argument. Number 4 would be your kind of theoretical orientation, your kind of methodology perhaps. And then 5, you might add a concluding sentence, so a statement of your contribution to the field, an existing argument, an existing body of literature, kind of more widely. So that's one way of kind of doing it. I'll say again that I think it is a little bit prescriptive, but I hope that it can actually be a useful way of just getting started in terms of writing your summaries. A publisher will always, as you saw on the previous slide, a publisher will always ask for a summary, and often they will talk about it as a kind of lay summary. So that's a summary that kind of quote unquote ordinary people can understand. So I think the key here and in breakout rooms as well is to talk about your research to your colleagues that are not necessarily specialists in your field, and who can kind of try, I suppose, a bit of an elevator pitch, if you like, of understanding your research. So just to say the lay summary abstract, I put some kind of language to those points. So, you might say your thesis or your book title is a study of, it focuses on, or, the book focuses on this unique or understudied data or idea. And then you might, I think, very confidently say, I argue, or I ask this set of questions with reference to such and such a theory. I show how maybe this way of looking at it is more appropriate than the way previous people have looked at it. And then finally, this research thereby kind of encourages us or forces us to rethink, to think more closely, to think differently about such and such a discipline or such and such an existing approach in the wider literature. So that might be a kind of a very kind of broad idea of what you might do in this. So what I was going to do, you can see the link to the Padlet is there, but I'm conscious I need to pop that in the chat, so bear with me a second. I'm also then going to open up breakout rooms, but again, please bear with me. So the link to the Padlet is back in the chat, and then I'm now going to put you into breakout rooms of about 5 people each for about 5 minutes. So bear with me a second. And I'm going to create the rooms, and yeah, put them for 5 minutes. So you should now be able to join the breakout rooms.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Pritesh Chakraborty from India, Kolkata, and my PhD was on comic books, American mainstream superhero comic books. So, hi David, I can see you and no one else. Okay, there are other few people here. Adriana, Amanda. Hello everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
So, how do we want to start this?
Shall I start?
Perfect.
Hi, I will look briefly at the 2 second. Hi. So my thesis, well, I'm trying to convert in a book. The title is Indigenous People, Environmental Rights Under International Law. The thesis focuses on the right of indigenous people, specifically environmental rights, which are interlinked with their right subsistence rights. I ask the question whether are effectively protected, and I argue are not effectively protected. In that case, I look at how can we actually protect it, and I look specifically some legal theory on human rights that are really important to indigenous people, and those are linked with their ecological worldview. So not having human rights just for humans, but also for animals, and look also at the importance for indigenous people to their future generations. And finally, I'll look at what I should supposed to look at it. So I look at the opportunity that creating, and my main argument is actually that indigenous people need to have recognized a legally binding environmental right, which is not recognized at the moment. And the reason for this is because that will open opportunities for not just protect indigenous people environmental rights for their present and future generation, but also protect their environment, the natural environment. And finally, it's also a matter of justice because they are the people who are most affected by, for instance, climate change or environmental pollution. And that is the summary of my book. Thank you.
ঠিক আছে, আমি তাহলে কি করব, কালকে যাব?
চলো,
ঠিক আছে, কালকে তাহলে যাব।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে,
আমি ফোন করছি একবার।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে।
Who wants to go next? Or do we want to?
I could go. Yeah, I could go next. Well, I am struggling. Struggling how to the complexity of writing a book out of a PhD thesis. We've got all the techniques, but I am, when you cannot see the wood for the trees, it's a bit difficult. But I have a title that summarizes the findings, which is When Home is Patria. Because I'm talking about, we have to leave now. Leave breaker. Oh my goodness, that's it.
Cool. We have 1 more minute, so can you
Go
ahead and finish?
So it's this huge issue of the return to the country of your origins once you have been a refugee, and so there are very many variables, and I choose to go for the political side of return, which is voluntary repatriation. So my finding is that people in my case study, which is Chile, did not return home. All the discourses, all the narratives are going back to the patria. So home was patria. So that's the title of the book I'm intended to publish, but it's quite complex, bro.
Recording in progress.
In the main room. I hope that was useful to be able to talk a little bit, even for a few minutes, about the idea of putting together a summary or an abstract and sharing that with other people on the call. I wondered, would anyone be prepared to kind of volunteer some information about how they might have changed their approach to abstract writing, or perhaps whether you'd be able to prepared to give an example of what you changed about it. Yeah, sorry, I see Rebecca. You got your hand.
Yeah, hi Joseph. Yeah, I think the 5-part framework's brilliant. I will confess that I hadn't read the email fully, so I hadn't done my full 250 words before coming on the call, and then rapidly created 250 words during the first 5 to 10 minutes. So in the Padlet, mine is The Strategies of Gossip in the Spanish Realist Novel. I could read it out for people, but to cut to the chase, your point, I'm trying to remember which point it was in your slides, but your point about, it's point 4, your theoretical framework, it's just absent from my summary. Yeah, and it's critical, isn't it, to say I use a number of, I look at philosophy, I look at different theories of knowledge, I also look at psychoanalytical theory on gossip, and it's just not there. It's kind of fundamental. So I'm very grateful. So that's a short example of, I think the other elements are there, but that's a critical missing link.
সে ঠিক আছে, সেটা নিয়ে কোনো
তোমার বক্তব্যটা কি? তোমাকে তো তুমি কোনোদিন ক্লাসেও আসো না আমার, বৃহস্পতিবার শুক্রবার 2 দিন থাকে, যদি দেরি করে ক্লাস তাই জন্য কেউ আসছো না। within the existing context of what's going on, but it's about what you bring to that as well, I think, and that's why it's important to have that bit in there. It's like, how is your work
সেটা কি
maybe
কোনোদিন
shifting
জানিয়েছো? তাহলে
perspectives
সেই
or
রকম ব্যবস্থা আমি
altering the
করতাম।
kinds of work
তোমরা তো
that's
একটু
already
জানাও
going on
আমায়।
in a wider theoretical sense. So it's not just the very specificity of what you're contributing to a very specific field, it's how that sits within the broader kind of methodological,
এখন
theoretical
বকছি তোমায়?
considerations that happen within the wider field. So yeah, I'm glad that was useful.
যাকে
Really useful.
বুধবার
Thank you.
এসো, বুধবার কথা হবে যে কখন
Was there
মানে
anyone else
একটা
who
দুটো ক্লাস
had
তো
any who
তোমাদেরকে
wanted to
পড়তে হবে।
volunteer?
আমার তো কিছু সিলেবাস আছে, সেই
Any kind of
সিলেবাস আমি
changes that they
তোমাদের
made
সবাইকে
or
অ্যাবসেন্ট করে
thoughts they
দিই।
had?
এবার
কিছুই শোনা যাচ্ছে না, সব কাটাকাটা হচ্ছে।
বলছি যে আমি তো তোমাদের অ্যাবসেন্ট করে দিই। আমার তো দুটো ক্লাস মানে জোর জবরদস্তি হোক দুটো ক্লাস দেওয়া
Jane.
হয়েছে, সেই দুটো ক্লাসে কিন্তু তোমরা সবাই অ্যাবসেন্ট
hello.
থাকো।
I just wanted to follow on from what the
শোনো,
previous person
বুধবার
about the
আমি
theoretical
যাচ্ছি কলেজ,
orientation.
কালকে যাব না। বুধবার আমার সাথে দেখা করো, ঠিক আছে? ফোন করে নেবে।
The thesis and the work from the thesis that's going to be turned into
হ্যাঁ,
either
ইন্টারনাল
a book or
টাও
an
বলে দেবো, ঠিক
article
আছে?
is transdisciplinary. Is
ঠিক
it
আছে,
a good
রাখছি তাহলে।
idea to mention within
হ্যাঁ,
the
ইন্টারনালটাও বলে দেবো, ঠিক আছে?
orientation which disciplines they are?
হ্যালো,
So
Hello.
in my case, it would be memory studies, ethnography, and possibly social anthropology from what the feedback I got following my Viva.
My short answer would be yes, Jane. I think it is important to mention those fields because I think it highlights, I mean, it makes it, in a very practical sense, I can imagine it makes it easier for a reviewer to place, for the publisher to place your work and identify reviewers for your work. But I think it is important to be very confident about the areas that you intervene in and to be very clear about what those interventions are. And I'm very conscious that you won't be able to do that within 250 words, but I think just flagging that in the summary is important. I don't know if, Emma, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just exactly what Joe has said. Basically, yes, it's about how you're situating your own work. That's really helpful in that kind of high-level overall summary for reviewers, as Joe said, but yeah, for publishers as well. It gives us an idea of the areas which we will be able to promote your book into, and kind of where it might fit in our own list and our own kind of publishing plans, as well as, yes, the academic contribution and intervention that you'll be making as well. So yes, definitely flag any disciplines that you'll be covering, and if you're taking a particular interdisciplinary methodological approach that is interesting or innovative, definitely always worth putting in as well.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So we've got about, we've kind of come to the, I guess, the formal end of today, but we've got a fair bit of time for, well, we've got about 15 minutes for questions. I'm conscious there's questions in the chat. I'm conscious I need to revisit the poll from this morning, from a couple of hours ago or an hour and a half ago. And then we've also got, I wanted, before we go, to just pop a link to our feedback form in the chat, if that's okay, and we'd really be grateful if people could complete that. Just, I've got it on the screen there, but I'm conscious you won't be able to click on the screen, so I'll just copy and paste the link into the chat. If you could provide some feedback about today, that would be really, really useful for myself and Emma to think about the ways in which we deliver this session in the future. And I've just posted that link in the chat. But we do have time for more questions if people would like to ask questions live, or if I could just perhaps revisit the poll from this morning and see if there were any interesting questions in there.